We're good.
All right.
Willis.
I'm sure he'll be here any second. Good morning, everyone. All right. The fields are going to be open today. All right. Well, we've got a great discussion here that we are continuing around ball field management. And this has been a long-standing priority. A number of years ago, I learned from a PTA volunteer that they were maintaining their school's field. They were watering it in the summer, and it had just been resodded. And I asked some questions about why that was happening. And we found out that a long-standing agreement between Parks and Rec had been a casualty of the recession. And we all sat down and we got back together and we got on track. And since then, we have revolutionized our ball field program. It's been a big priority for the chair and the council, the committee, especially my colleague, Mr. Rice. And as a result, now we've got hundreds of fields that are hopefully being well maintained and renovated regularly, but we're going to get an update on that today. So Pam has been working to prepare our packet, and she'll take us through.
Good morning. Yes, I'm here with Vivian Yao. She also co-authored the staff report with me because we're here with the joint committees to cover ball fields and to get an update. And as you mentioned in the staff report, there's information on the background of the program and the current status of the fields, but I do know that the staff at the Parks Department do have a PowerPoint that they'd like to present, and I don't want to cover information for you that then they want to cover in their PowerPoint. So Cliff, I'll ask if you'd like to get started with that first, or do you want me to cover more background?
I think we can get started. I just want to make a couple points before you'll see some of this in the, I'm sorry?
Introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Casey Anderson, Chair of the Park and Planning Commission. As Councilmember Reamer had said, ball fields have been a major focus during the period when I've been chair. But more than that, I think that this is an example of two things that I've also tried to advance. One is more systematic use of data. So we're getting more rigorous about evaluating everything that we do so we can make better management decisions to use public resources most efficiently. And we've really made some great strides in ball fields and understanding field conditions and how to maintain them at a high level of play. And in parallel with that, to focus more on equity. And data intersects with equity in a very important way with ball fields, because we have not only tried to understand what are the areas of the county that really should get an equity focus for all sorts of public investment and infrastructure, but also where do those two things come together? We have athletic fields that are in poor condition, that get a lot of play, that are also in these equity focus areas. And so I hope you'll be pleased by the steps that we've taken in that direction. It's not perfect yet. There's all sorts of different ways that you can look at the question of which ball field should be prioritized. Some of it is a function of MCPS's capital program of where they're doing renovations, and we try to stay out of their way and work with them so we can complement them and not interfere with their access to school sites. But we've tried very hard over the last few years to try to focus on those places that have been neglected in the past for a variety of reasons, and I hope that that comes through. The last thing I'd say is that this is responsive to the council's request during the last couple of budget cycles, where every time we have this conversation about when can you get to renovate more of these MCPS fields, because MCPS has long acknowledged they're not in the business of maintaining turf for high level of athletic play and community use, or even for that matter for use by the school children during the day. So everybody has wanted to see this happen, and thanks to your leadership and initiative, this has really focused our attention. How can we get this last group of sites done so we can take on the maintenance for all those elementary and middle school fields? There will be some, and this is not really bad news, but I guess you'd say it's in the nature of things that you weren't really thinking about until you really dove into the details. Small play areas that are not suitable for permitted athletic field use, but we think that the next sort of question to be asked is what to do with those sites so they can not only be usable by MCPS children to serve their needs for PE and recreation, but also can be permitted. So we're thinking of, and I've talked to Jack Smith about this, putting together a working group to study those smaller sites to say, is there some combination of hardscape or futsal or some sort of play areas that are not necessarily soccer or baseball fields, but they're also usable by the community as well as the school children. I'm actually very excited about it, so which is why I say it's not bad news, it's just different news that was something we hadn't really thought about until very recently. Cliff? Or Mike?
So I have to get in a few words. Mike Riley, Director of Parks. We're very excited to be here. We've been talking to you about athletic fields for a long time. As Councilmember Reamer said, this is not a new conversation. It was just about 20 years ago. There was a huge countywide effort that involved parks, recreation, CUP, the sports leagues, and it was called Ball Field Initiatives. And it was mainly geared at that time about how we were going to meet the growing demand for the sports leagues. There was leagues that MSI, BCC Baseball, other big leagues were growing. They were turning kids away because there was not enough fields. So in addition to improving field quality at parks and schools, the big focus back then was how are we going to get more fields? We were adding lights. We were improving fields that were substandard that no one wanted to use. We were doing all kinds of things to add fields to the inventory. And then after about 4 years of effort in about 2003, we had renovated a little bit more than half of the elementary and middle schools, taken them into the parks fold, and then some tough economic times hit and some other priorities came up, and it kind of went in a holding pattern for more than a decade, where Parks was maintaining a little bit more than half of the elementary and middle schools that had been upgraded, and MCPS still had ownership and control of the remaining ones. 4 years ago in fiscal year 17, we picked back up incrementally. We've been renovating 4 or 5 elementary or middle school sites per year. We've pretty much taken care of all the middle schools. The ones that are left are elementary schools, and you asked us to come back and give you a plan and recommendations for how we were going to complete this effort of taking into parks management the remaining elementary schools, and that's what Cliff's going to talk to you about. There's a little bit of a new focus now. It's not so much about quantity of fields. It's more about quality and equity, about making sure that these assets that are so valuable are in the shape we want them to be to meet the needs of the school kids during the school day, and then to maximize community use on the weeknights and weekends. There's over 700 fields. If you add up parks, county recreation centers, and schools, there's over 700 of these publicly owned assets in the county. They're extremely important for health and wellness, for exercise and activity, for sports, for community gathering, and we want to make sure they're cared for in the most responsible way. So with that, I will turn it over to Cliff Driver. He's our program manager for fields, is in these areas that we've prioritized very highly. The chair and I, over the last 4 years, we've asked one individual to pull together all the team members that are involved with fields. As you can imagine, it takes a village. You have to permit them. You have to have park police enforce rules. You have to maintain them, manage them, renovate them. So Cliff is the glue behind all that is athletic fields for us. So he's got some slides he's going to run you through, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
All right. Good morning, Cliff Driver, Montgomery Parks Athletic Field Program Manager. I'm excited to be able to sit in front of you today to lay out a plan that we've put together for the MCPS athletic fields that are not currently in our maintenance inventory. We'll get started off. Maybe. There we go. So our vision, deliver sustainable athletic fields using optimal standards of design, construction, and maintenance that are playable, accessible, safe for recreational activities. So we use the word recreational because it's not only about competition fields, right? We include the competition fields in this, but there's a huge aspect to what goes into an athletic field that is just basic recreation with a parent and their child, or maybe some children after school, right? It doesn't always have to be programmed. So our accelerated plan. This slide, we kind of talk a little bit more about what we're currently doing. We have 89 elementary, middle, and high school sites currently in our maintenance contract. This includes weekly dragging, mowing, lining, monthly infield grading, biannual aerification, seeding, nutrient management, and infield mix addition. That's on an annual basis. Our current contract value is right at $1.5 million. That's across all 201 fields. The renovated sites get included into this maintenance contract on an annual basis. So these numbers do fluctuate. And the one thing, if anything, that I would try to express is that the numbers today will change tomorrow because of the fact as we continue to add sites, and then we lose some sites due to some MCPS construction, right? There we go. All right, so after we worked with MCPS to identify all the sites, we came up with 26 sites that currently have athletic fields that are not in our inventory in terms of maintenance. So that includes 29 fields. We went back and forth between sites and fields. We're trying to be very specific moving forward that we talk about sites so that the numbers don't, once again, get more confusing when you have different numbers. So we put that in there for fields just to make sure that everybody understood that at times there are more than one field per site. It especially happens at middle and high schools. For the most part, our elementaries are laid out with just one rectangular field. Athletic fields, the way that we've reviewed their inventory, an athletic field is anything over 24,000 square feet. We feel like that's the smallest area that we can do an actual recreation space on. At 23,999, that becomes a small play space site that would be designed maybe a little bit different than what an athletic field would be. The priority renovation list was created with a focus on social equity data. We also use some ball field collector information and to make sure that we're looking at geographic spacing to make sure we're not closing 4 schools within the same 2-mile radius and we had no area for not only students but our programming to be able to recreate. So we're broken up into 4 quadrants. We are a massive county, as you guys fully understand. The contract at one point was one full contract, and it was extremely large. Almost too large for any one contractor to take care of on their own. So we broke it up into 4 separate contracts, Quad 1, 2, 3, and 4. Quad 1 is in our northeast quadrant of the county. Quad 2 is in our southeast. Quad 3 is in our lower western portion of the county. And Quad 4 is in our northeast or northwestern portion of the county. It runs counterclockwise. This slide, what it's depicting is to showing you the number of sites that have fields. Quad 1 and Quad 2 have a lot more sites that have fields, and it's our population density, right? It's where we have more schools. Quad 3 and Quad 4 on our western side, on the western part of 270, we're not as dense population, right? But some of those sites are larger, and they have more athletic fields on them. You will see column, and I should have labeled them as columns, but column D, we're currently having 4 renovation sites in Quad 2. We have 1 in Quad 1. You'll see a heavy focus in column E, where we have 11 and 12 in Quad 1 and Quad 2. Quad 3 and Quad 4, for the most part, we have most of the inventory there, and that's reflected in our priority listing as well. So this map, the reason why we continue to put this map in there for everybody is to show them, or to show everyone, the current inventory, the current MCPS inventory that's out there. So your yellow dots are elementary and middles that are currently under contract. Your red dots are not currently under contract, right? So the red dots include not only athletic fields but also play spaces, as well as current construction sites. But you'll see a huge emphasis on our lower east side of the county where some of our smaller sites exist. And that's where our priority list kind of comes into it, where that's where our focus is for the first couple years. Moving forward, this is our plan. It may be a little blurry up on that screen. The very top of the plan will show you the 5 current sites that we're working on in FY20, and we're excited about those. And then we move forward into a 4-year plan, right? So when we originally talked, I guess it's 2.5 years ago, we looked at it from like an 8 to 10 year plan, right? And then we started diving into the data, and you guys came back, and there was a real push to try to see if we could do it in 3 or 4 years. So where we are right now is a 4-year plan. It's plus or minus about 6 sites a year. This is fluid with MCPS, with some of their construction projects. as well as timing and weather and whatnot. But this is our current plan moving forward with the expectation that when FY25 rolled around, we would have all of the sites, and then we'd go back into a renovation list of the existing sites that we currently maintain. So what this slide shows is the recommended renovation sites. Listed out, there are 26 that we've identified that have athletic fields that need to be rolled into the contract. You'll see a push on the 270 corridor, as well as our lower east side of the county. And we have prioritized these using a social equity basis to make sure that we are going after the sites that need our aggressive improvements the quickest, right? So we do have a social equity framework that we put together.
Yeah, and this is where we get to the application of the ideas that we developed with this is where we get to applying the map that we developed for the Energized Public Spaces Plan, the Urban Parks Plan. This is it's a relatively crude instrument, and we plan on refining it over time, but we feel like this is a good starting point for just focusing our attention on a combination of places with lower income, relatively high proportion of people of color. We're going to prioritize the athletic fields, and you see on that slide, the renovation order matches the social equity score order perfectly. Now, I'm not going to tell you that it's actually going to be in that order because, as I said before, a lot of our ability to renovate depends on MCPS and when they need to be on the site doing something else. So we're not going to pretend that this is exactly the way it's going to happen in the real world, but we're trying to start from the point of racial and social equity and work from there around some of the other practical considerations that we have to deal with.
Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you. So can you again describe what are those practical considerations with MCPS, and have you had then conversation regarding this particular tool and see how they can then work to align those priorities?
Typically, MCPS, their building renovations sometimes are a moving target. And we understand that. Sometimes things come up, they decide they can't meet the schedule they were originally planning, they shift their priorities, they decide to move money around. And so sometimes we're planning on renovating a site, and they'll tell us kind of at the last minute, that's not going to work because we need to be on this, we're going to be tearing the building down, we're going to be using that athletic field as a staging area, so you can't be doing work on the site. That's what I'm talking about. So we will make every effort, and they've been very cooperative at trying to work with us collaboratively to identify the sites that really need to come first, but we just recognize that sometimes other considerations will get in the way. It will basically be like this list. That will be the first starting point in our minds as we're talking to them about which sites to do in which order, but we're just being upfront about the fact that there will be other things that get in the way of, and so it probably won't be on that rank order 1 through 34 or whatever it is. It's not. It's going to change.
And is there a time when we can get an update on where the gaps have been and how it's just not matching what you have proposed?
I would say that we're happy to provide the information as that becomes apparent to us. In the past, we found that it can shift pretty quickly. So we will certainly keep you up to date on that. And I don't think it's not that there's going to be some radical departure from the order in this list. It's just to acknowledge that there will be some movement up and down based on what they're doing with their school renovation.
Got it. Thanks.
Moving forward. There we go. Moving forward, just to recap, we're at a 4-year plan to renovate 26 schools. We're plus or minus 8. That's going to fall to 6. It's going to climb sometimes to 9 or 10 in any fiscal year, and sometimes that fluctuates because of the weather and when we can get in to do work. Right. So if you're building a building, sometimes weather doesn't make nearly the impact as what an athletic field does. But when you're working soils, you can push through a project and have extreme compassion, and you look back on it and you wish that you would have had that extra time to be able to let that soils dry themselves out prior to moving forward with the renovation. So we're asking for $600,000 per year in ball field initiatives. That's what our plan is right now. and then continued life cycle renovation funding in FY '25 and beyond. So what we're asking for on that is, after we have the 26 sites completed, we need to roll back around into those sites that were renovated in that 99 to 03 window, because for the last 20 years, they've just been maintained. So we talk about the fact that we do need life cycle replacements, and we would immediately go after the 26 that need urgent improvements through renovation, and then we'd roll that back in with life cycle replacement. Just kind of an overview. Total number of MCPS elementary and middle school sites is 195. 119 is the number of sites currently maintained by parks. And there's a little difference in that number, and you'd ask yourself, what is the difference between, in a previous slide, he had talked about the fact that we had 89 sites, right? So we have park school sites. A lot of people don't understand that during the development of some of these schools, our property adjoins where MCPS property was, and when the school was designed, it was designed to use the park as a footprint for recreation, right? So we've got 24 of them, 24, 25 located throughout the county, and those are the exclusive green space that those schools have for recreation, for physical education, or recess. As we've said before, 26 support athletic fields. We've identified 18 that are small play spaces. 13 are in current or future MCPS construction, and 19 of them are leased or in an adoptive field agreement.
So I'm going to talk about this concept of these small school sites. When these schools were originally designed, there was probably a diamond shape or a rectangle shape drawn on the plan for the school, but because it was a small site, the ability to keep grass on those spaces has proved to be very, very challenging. So given that the Parks Department got into this business with the schools about fields, we wanted to make a distinguishment here where these open spaces or lawn areas at the school are arguably too small to support what one would consider an athletic field. However, they're obviously still extremely valuable spaces for the kids as part of the educational and recreational program during the school day, for recess, for PE, for after-school activity. And then what we want is that on the weeknights and weekends, they can serve as a valuable recreational amenity for the surrounding community. They're arguably been one of the more difficult operational and maintenance challenges for MCPS in an attempt to keep grass on those. So in discussions with MCPS and with Director Gren White of the Planning Department, we want to partner with them to look at best practices around the country, to look at options for how you can design and maintain these small school sites, outdoor spaces, to maximize the benefit for both the kids and the community throughout the year. We already have a lot of different ideas. The chair has mentioned some concepts, but this is something we want to get on right away and figure out what the Parks Department's role in those sites will be going forward. At this particular time, over the next 4 years, we're not showing you any investment in those sites, but I think the first step is to figure out how they are best managed and maintained, and then take it from there.
So just pause on this topic for a moment, but MCPS has had its own small play spaces CIP project, which we worked carefully with them to fund. Are you suggesting that, you know, you like that, you like what you've seen, and you think that Parks is prepared to kind of move into that space? I mean, why? I'm just curious, why are you? Why not leave it to MCPS? They're doing it.
We're to be perfectly direct about it. We're
Yeah.
concerned that if MCPS does it on their own, they'll be thinking exclusively of what goes on during the school day for the school children, and that's understandable. But we got into this sort of relationship with MCS where we're maintaining athletic fields because they provide additional community use beyond just the school day and the school program. So if we're going to be involved with some of these small play spaces, they have to serve some community use in addition to what is good for the school kids during the day. If these were simply more elaborate playgrounds, that might not serve much community use. we think that there's ways to make whatever is built in these small spaces complementary. So they're good for the school children and they're also good for community use. But we're concerned that if we don't collaborate with them up front, that some of that community use will get left by the wayside. And I've talked to the superintendent and he's in agreement, and we are, I think, both excited about working together on this.
I think we could come back to this if we have time. I'm glad to hear you talking to the superintendent. That's the kind of main thing I wanted to identify. We have MCPS here. We may want to hear from them enough. Let's work through the other issues. I think some of the other issues are probably more urgent at the moment. Thank you. Oh, Gabe.
Thank you, Chairman Rice and Chairman Reamer, for allowing me to be in this committee session. I've been very interested in the ball field issue for a long time and have seen sort of the evolution and have been incredibly impressed with the innovation and the flexibility from which we're tackling this issue. Just on the small spaces, I just want to say a couple things. One, this is a huge opportunity because when you look at the access and use, particularly as it relates to futsal, if there were another viable location for adults or children to be able to play, then that will help offset some of the use on the grass fields. So it has a secondary positive impact of mitigating some of the use on the fields themselves. The United States Soccer Foundation, in the same way the NHL is making grants available to convert some of the inline skating rinks, is making pretty significant funds available to local jurisdictions through public-private partnerships for exactly this kind of conversion. And I would suggest that you not just limit to looking at best practices within our country, but around the world. Brazil, as an example, has done some incredibly innovative work in the parks and recreation space in highly dense urban areas where they've created these magnificent play spaces for people to be able to play soccer primarily, but also volleyball and some other sports, again, to help sort of create yet another viable option for people. So I think this is a very wise investment and will really expand the recreational opportunities. And also, most of these games are unstructured. And so, you still have the issue of the cell phone leagues, which of course has not entirely gone away. And I think this would help address some of that issue as well.
Point, and we had asked Parks to look at sites that might be available to convert for futsal, and we can get an update on that perhaps in the near future. But I think you really are speaking to a crucial issue. A lot of our parks were designed without the idea of a hardscape soccer space. Mm-hmm. And as you said, a lot of countries are recognizing that that's a real problem, and they're not, kids don't have enough place to play soccer, and it's very weather dependent. So when it's wet, it's really hard to play on a grass field, but you can still play on a hardscape field, actually. And so we've been working on conversions. We have our first conversion planned of a partial tennis court, and of course the tennis folks are keeping an eye on this very closely, but at the Silver Spring Intermediate Park. But I had sent a letter asking for a comprehensive review of all available spaces. I don't know if it's parking lots or basketball courts or tennis courts, but wherever there's underutilized hardscape, we ought to be looking at conversion. I'm not sure how the schools fit into that, but that's an interesting point.
We will have good news for you.
Okay, so we'll make sure that we'll figure out how to discuss this. I think it's generally a park CIP, but if it's going to involve MCPS, then it'll be joint, so we'll just see.
Just one other thought, Mr. Chairman. I think that these because they're smaller, because they're, within larger areas, lights here make more sense than obviously general fields, which I know is a contentious issue to say the least. But that would also expand access and use, which we've seen in other urban areas across the country and in the District of Columbia. It's had very positive results in giving people a positive outlet to engage, to do something productive with their time.
Good. Well, we'll come back to this important topic soon. I do want to make sure we all just get a chance to talk about the budget, the $600,000 needed for the renovation program. So where are we in the presentation?
So the 600,000 over the next 4 years, we've recommended, as you know, the way we revived this program in fiscal year 17 was fund balance in the CUP Enterprise Fund. Our submitted CIP, which is up here now, does show that $600,000 a year being funded through that fund source.
Okay, say that again?
The way we resuscitated this program of parks renovating the school fields in fiscal year 17 was through use of undesignated fund balance in the CUP Enterprise Fund. They had built up a fairly significant reserve, and over the last 4 years, that has been the fund source. I think it's 1.25 million over the last 4 years. Has been expended, or in the process of these last 5 fields that we're doing now will be expended when those are done. So we are proposing $600,000 a year over the next 4 years from that fund source to complete the remaining elementary schools that have large fields.
Is this in the Parks CIP
In the Parks
submission?
CIP, which has been submitted.
It has been submitted, I see. So, the comment from CUP at the moment that they don't necessarily agree about that funding source is a timely one because the executive branch is preparing its CIP submission on January 15th. Ms. Bell Pearson.
Thank you. Ramona Bell Pearson, Director of Community Use of Public Facilities. Yes, in fact, we do have serious reservations about this and are opposed to it being designated as our enterprise fund being designated as a source. We're required, as you're aware, to keep 10% of total resources in reserve. And under a plan to use the enterprise fund as the sole funding source for this, we would end up with a 9% reserve as of FY23, and it would go to 1% in FY24 and be negative after that. Additionally, and that's assuming that that is the main draw, because we also have additional expenses, as I think has been indicated in council staff's report, of the ActiveNet software that we need to continue to maintain, and we need to explore what's going to happen after active. So we are very concerned. We also have a move coming up to Wheaton, where we are going to be a tenant in the facility with our partners here at the table, and we have expenses that are already budgeted as well as unforeseen expenses that we're aware are starting to come on the table. So these are very serious concerns for us.
Okay, I will pass it to my colleague here. Just a quick question. What share of the revenue for CUP is from the fields permit fees?
I can't say that specifically. We haven't broke that out, but we can provide that to council.
Could you please? I mean, at a minimum, I'd like to understand whether we are expending ball field fees revenue, on ball fields or not. I don't know that necessarily is determinative either, but I would like very much to know, what the revenue is that CUP has. And
Well, I can tell you that it's a very, very low hourly rate.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the range of maybe $5 an hour. And we are not returning any money because it's so low, because between staff expenses of the permitting process and the maintaining and the collection, it's not really a profitable, there's no profit involved.
Okay, you're saying the revenue source is probably pretty small.
It is, right.
And you are studying your fees generally?
We are we're about to undergo a comprehensive fee study. It'll be the first time in the history that the full array of our services will be examined. Outside consultants will be retained. We are in the process of working with procurement. We have received approval from the CAO to have outside members on our QSC, which will be very helpful because it's important to have input, I believe, from our partners, Parks, as well as MCPS.
Thank you. Now, Parks is submitting you're submitting your CIP and you designated this as a revenue source. I guess I don't know that you're allowed to designate, for example, GO bonds. I mean, you have your own Parks CIP that this is part of your broader asks. So I don't know if we'll answer this question today or not, but generally speaking, I think we should be trying to figure out, do we think that's the right number, 600,000? Are we in agreement about that? And if so, what do we think are the available sources? And that's something that we'll just have to work through over the course of this spring. Mr. Rice.
So let me actually step back a little bit because I just want to make sure that I understand. So that we had gone through the list of, let's call it the equity plan of initiatives for field investment. Is that a part of the $600,000 or is because you had mentioned two different things, and so if they're all encompassed, that's fine. There's the plan to go back to some of the older fields and redo those, because I heard you mention that in the presentation. And then there's the part about getting to the fields that are not yet managed. Is that all encompassed in that $600,000 per year?
So the list of fields, which is what, 26 sites?
Right.
That is all the sites that need to be renovated, that are big enough to accommodate permitted use. They are prioritized based on the equity analysis.
Gotcha.
Coming back to the old fields, and I think the first one was Eastern Middle School.
Right.
That was done in, 20 years ago?
Right.
So that would probably be first in the queue to get a major renovation. It was renovated a long time ago, soil's compacted, been in use for a long time, needs to get some new, fresh work done.
Understood. So, and that's all encompassed in that $600,000 a year plan that you gave?
Everything, all the 26, not the let's go back to the beginning of the queue and start over again.
Oh, okay.
That would follow after we do this over the next, if you fund this through whatever source, and we get through those 26 sites, then we will turn to the question of how to, starting with Eastern Middle School or whatever the first ones were on the list, how do we fix those again?
Okay. So let me just say this, that it's interesting, and Councilmember Navarro and I were just talking about this, about how the reason why this equity plan is so important is because of what we saw on that map. Because if you look down the list and you just go down 270, all the ones on the left, the majority of them are managed, the ones on the right are not. Division between west, more affluent, east, less affluent, south, even more less affluent, more of them less managed. So that's the reason why we did this work of this racial equity and social justice policy. And so thank you for getting on board and saying, wait a minute, we see the same thing happening, because we said it's happening all over government. And so I appreciate being and saying, you know what, we've got to do this differently, because we see that it's just happened, and it could be via activism, it could be via all the different things that we know contribute to this. So thank you for acknowledging that that's there and putting that map there, because it's very striking and tells the story that we know is reflective of everything that we do here in the county. So thank you for that. That being said, I think that this is an important priority for us. And so from that perspective, whether it comes from CUF, and I certainly understand the concerns of CUF when it comes to earmarking that as the designated source, the reality is that this work needs to be done under the auspices of our racial equity and social justice lens. That's the justification for the work. And so regardless of what the source is, the reality is that it needs to be done, because we have an inequity that exists right now in our community, and we can't let that continue. I will say that, and Ms. Bell Pearson, as you mentioned about fee restructuring, one of the things that reminded me about this inequity was when my daughter was playing, unfortunately, as I lament, another sport that she stopped playing, but she was playing soccer for a few years. And so we would have practices on the myriad of fields that Parks owns. And so the coach would reserve the field, just as you said, for the minimal amount of expense, and that's great. But I pay for my daughter to play soccer. And at the time when my daughter is playing soccer with her team and practicing on those fields, they're the neighborhood kids who can't then use that field. And so the one thing about equity that we've talked about for a long time, and Mr. Riley, you and I have talked about this when it came to Ridge Road and the challenges there. We have all these great amenities, but the reality is we still haven't been yet to figure out how to ensure that a neighborhood field is a neighborhood field, right? And it's a challenge, because you've got to then be able to maintain it. You've got to have people who will take care of it in the community and understand that if we let you use it, it means that you also have to take ownership of it and treat it with respect and do all the things that are necessary, because then it becomes an inordinate expense. I get all of it. But I think that at some point we've got to figure that piece out, because just as you talked about those play spaces that are at those schools, that are those hubs as well, these fields are also the same exact thing. And so understanding that and Mr. Riley will know this all too well with the cricket field. I always used to talk about how the kids were playing cricket behind my house in the street. And so, sure, we opened up the beautiful cricket field at Germantown Soccerplex, but guess what? That's not going to change the fact that that's not accessible to them. It is if they join the league and play formal cricket, but when they're practicing, when they want to do where do they go? They're still going to be in the street. They're still going to be to where futsal and all these places and folks who want to practice soccer and practice all these things. Where do you go, right? And so it is one of those where I think in future, and again, it's not to criticize this is great, but just as a part of our thinking about our concept of taking over these fields, about doing these kinds of things, I hope that we're thinking about that too, and that part of it, to where unrestricted play in terms of being able to access these things is going to also be incredibly important. So I just wanted to put that out there.
That's a good point, you know. I certainly spent my youth back at my school, the fields there, the hardscape, the asphalt. That's how we played when we were growing up, on asphalt.
Kickball,
Uphill both. It actually was, believe it or not.
Walk 20 miles.
In the California snow.
Are you suggesting that our parks lead, Mr. Friedson?
Yeah, way back when I grew up, we played barefoot. No. First of all, I want to thank everybody for this conversation, all the work that has gone into this. During the budget, we had specifically asked and talked about how we address this issue and bring all the stakeholders together. I had specifically personally asked of what would the specific dollar amount be and the specific plan be in order to get all of this done as quickly as possible, because the community desperately needs it. And I think Parks and CUF and council staff, Councilmember Albernaz and I co-led a group with our staffs with all the stakeholders over the summer, and I think we've gotten to a really good place where we now have a plan. We have some details to work out here, and but I think we're at a really good place, and special thanks to the chairs of this joint committee, Council Members Reamer and Rice, who've been working on this for many budget cycles and moving the ball forward. I think we've made a lot of progress, and I think what this does is start to formalize it in a comprehensive plan, which I think we have lacked up to this point. We've prioritized it in a significant way, and we've really moved the needle, but we haven't had a formal plan that itemized what the needs are. And so I really appreciate it. And, as I was raising it during the budget process and we were talking about it in our committee, Councilmember Albernaz was having meetings with the PTA and other stakeholders. I see the PTA is represented here as well. And so a lot of folks are involved in this. There's a lot of interest. We all agree that it's needed. And so just wanted to raise that, and council staff has really been instrumental in this as well. And so thank you to everybody involved for getting us to this point. I think that the plan, it actually came in to be more manageable than I had thought it was going to be when I had originally asked for it. 4 years, $600,000 a year, I think is a manageable price tag. And for something that is as needed and as necessary and as desired by community members for recreational opportunities, for health and well-being, mental health and physical health, for the quality of life that we talk about, I think this is a commitment we have to make. I'm totally appreciative of the challenge that CUF faces and the concerns raised based on the fiscal constraints that they have. My view would be, let's commit to the 600,000 and we can figure out where the commitment comes from. I think the fund balance for CUF is appropriate up to the point at which it no longer can occur, and we can subsidize that with other aspects of the budget, but we need to set a direction from the council to say that this is something that we're going to commit to do. And, I think we've been doing this anyway, right? I mean, during budget time, our council in our first budget year and the prior council in the previous budget years have added money to this effort at the last minute. I think it's been done with less of a plan than what we're talking about now. And so I think what we have the opportunity now to do is say, this is something that the council wants to do. This is something that we expect to do. We can send direction of our interest to the county executive as he prepares his budget of where we would like that money to come from. But ultimately, the most important aspect of this is to start moving the needle as quickly and as systematically and comprehensively as possible. And then during the budget, when the council is wrestling with our priorities, we can make the final decision, hopefully the same one that the county executive does in collaboration, but if not, make the final decision of where exactly, bless you, where exactly that money comes from. But just had a couple questions. One for Ms. Bell Pearson and CUP. You mentioned the CUP position. Has the board formally taken a position on this, or this is just concerns raised based on the fiscal realities from the staff?
There was a discussion at the recent board meeting. ICB met on December the 4th, I think it was, and we discussed this, and there was the general agreement that they were concerned about the CUF Enterprise Fund, and the priority for that board has always been the issue of our software, because we are, although it's an issue for all of the agencies, Parks and Rec as well as CUF, bear in mind, the Enterprise Fund is not only funding whatever happens with the software replacement or maintenance for CUF, but also for Rec. So we're paying 60% of whatever the final cost is going to be. And we need to make sure that our reserves are maintained, as well as enough operating is available for us to cover that. So that's the priority for the board.
So there's general agreement, but not necessarily a formal position on supporting or not supporting the proposal?
We haven't taken a vote, if that's what you're asking.
Got it, okay. And do you know, what is the current undesignated fund balance for CUP? Just in the context of, we're talking about $600,000, what's the current fund balance there?
I don't know specifically. I do have some documents here. I don't know that we've run that specifically for this as of today. We were submitting our budget as of Friday, and so there was back and forth, and I'd have to get that for you.
Right, well, if you could just share that with us, I think it would be helpful for us to be aware of what the, 600,000 is just a number, if we don't have the context of what the undesignated balance is. So I think that would be helpful for my purposes. As I said before, I think, my personal interest here and goal here is for us to indicate our interest in 600,000 being reasonable and appropriate to reach our goal. I think figuring out exactly if all 600,000 exactly for all 4 years can come out of CUP, I don't know that we necessarily would have to determine that today, but that would just be my
I can tell you
personal
that for FY20 and FY21, that 250,000 has been designated already, and that's based on the earlier request from the council under the establishment of the Ball Fields Initiative.
So
And
this would be 350,000 on top of that, or we're talking about 600,000 on top of the 250 per year?
I'm assuming if the 250 is already marked, we're talking an additional 350 for those first 2 years. What I'm hearing is that in the
That's
projection
even,
of how the CUP fund balance would be drawn down, and I was at the ICB board in December, there's a few days ago, representing the chair as a member, and concerns were expressed about the use of the CUP fund balance for the long term for this, but there was no, as Ramona said, there was no vote. The discussion was largely about other competing factors for the fund balance, ActiveNet, Silver Spring Civic Building. So I, as an ICB member, or alternate, I should say, have not seen the recent balance of the fund balance, but what I heard was that there are competing needs for it, not that it has been drawn down or that it's diminished over the last 4 to 5 years. As I've sat in ICB meetings, it sat in the range of $6-7 million. I don't know where it is now, but it's been a healthy chunk of money.
right, and I would just point out, I think, obviously there are needs there, but the goal is for the enterprise fund to be at zero after expenses. And so it's obviously above that. The question is figuring out what's the appropriate use of those funds. I happen to think that this is a very appropriate use of those funds, assuming that all the obligations that CUP has, like the software, can be covered and are handled, figuring out how that looks. If you could confirm the 350,000 net difference versus 600, if it's cumulative or not, that would be very important for our understanding. If it's 350,000, that's even more manageable than I was expecting, frankly. I thought that it was on top of, and so I think that would be welcome news for us and would make this very manageable as well. I just wanted to also raise the, we talk about getting to the 10%, below the 10% at 9% at the end of this life cycle. Obviously, they're user fees, so we don't know where exactly those fees would be, but that's based on, I presume, the projections that you're making on what the annual fees you're collecting on top.
That's correct. It's based on the current status. And as we've said, a fee study is going to be done with input and contribution from Parks as well as MCPS. As I mentioned, the fees currently are very low, related specifically to fields. And we have made past attempts to bring that more in line with Parks, which has higher fees, but that was met with quite a bit of community opposition, and even the board had concerns, the ICB board, because of the adverse impact on users, which we all have to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I hope as part of that, I think the facility fee assistance program that we use for indoor facilities, I think something similar to that would help to subsidize users, appropriate users, so that we can expand access to these facilities, I think is beyond appropriate. And I think as that assessment takes place for the fees, I hope that is part of it. And so that any modest increase, and obviously it has to be within reason, but any modest increase to any fees is done in a way that doesn't adversely affect groups and individuals and residents who we least want to harm in this particular setting. But I'll just end where I started. Thanks to everybody for your work on this. My goal is for us to just indicate our support. I think we have already done that and been doing that, and I think this just allows us to have a more systematic and formalized approach to be able to address a lot of the areas that have been raised earlier by the chairs and my colleagues. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good comments. The chair and I were just discussing our agreement that we want the 600,000, please, in the executive's proposed CIP, and we'll ask for the executive branch to figure out how to finance that, and whatever the executive branch. I'm not sure who I'm really looking at here. Where's OMB? Okay. Well, you don't have to come up, but I think you're hearing so far, but Mr. Juando's going to speak and others, but I think you're hearing a lot of support for the 600,000 to get the rest of the way through the sites, and then ultimately to designate a annual maintenance fund. Mr. Juando.
Thank you, Mr. Reamer and Mr. Rice, and to my colleagues. Thanks for everyone for being here. On the fee study, Ms. Bell-Pearson, what's the timing on that? I associate myself with a lot of the remarks, and I'm glad Councilmember Friesen went down that path, but what's the timing of when you expect to have that going?
We expect that procurement's going to be finished with their review. It's currently with procurement, and we expect the procurement is going to be finished with their review by the end of this month, so that we would hopefully have it on the street early next year. And by on the street, I mean it would be advertised usually for a period of at least 30 days, probably more like 60 days, to give more opportunity for more vendors to come in and submit a bid. And then the QSC would be reviewing to determine who was qualified, who met the parameters we've established, and then an award would be made. So I think it's usually like a 3-month period once it's issued, assuming
How
everything
long do you
moves.
I know you can't prejudge this, but the study of this size, I know it's not been undertaken. You think it takes the rest of 2020, or how long do you think it would take?
I would think at least the rest of FY20.
Okay, great, all right. FY20, okay, so even longer. Yeah, and even less, FY20, not 21. Okay, great.
Well, at least
I'll hold you to that.
preliminary information by then. I don't want to commit to.
No, that's fine, that's fine.
Come back to me July 1 and say what happened.
No, that's helpful. I just think it will inform a lot of the way we move forward, and it's related to this issue, obviously, too, as far as where the money comes from. I would agree generally with my colleagues that we want to prioritize ball field renovation, have a plan to do it, have an appropriate amount of money, and if you're telling us it's 600,000, 2.4 million over the next 4 years, that seems reasonable. The 500,000 for the life cycle replacement is in addition to the 600,000, correct? And okay, just wanted to.
no, it's not an addition.
It comes in years 5
successor.
and 6
It's a
of the
successor
CIP.
to
So you lose the 600,000 in years 5 and 6, and then we transition the program to life cycle. in years 5 and 6. So I wanted to ask a couple questions about the life cycle. So Mr. Rice mentioned we saw the disparities, and I do think it's important, Mr. Anderson and Mr. Riley, to include racial equity and social justice in how you discuss this. That was the bill we passed. Social equity, I know you shortened it maybe just for the presentation, and said social equity, but I think when you look at that map, race is a big factor. And I think we want to make sure that we talk about that and be open about that in all that we're doing. And as we're just starting to implement this, language matters, and when people are going to hear about this reported and why we're doing it, I think it's important to say racial equity and social justice. I just wanted to flag that for you as including that. So when I looked at that map, and I saw my elementary school was number 1 on the list, Oakview Elementary, of needing the renovation. I know that might change slightly. But what happened to have all these fields fall into such disrepair? And I'm assuming the life cycle will help keep that from happening going forward. But can you talk a little bit? I think it's worth a mention of how did this happen, and why, and how are we going to prevent it from happening? So we don't not back here. The previous councils, none of us will be here, but saying, hey, we need to correct this inequity going forward.
Well, keep in mind that this list is all sites that have been under MCPS management up until this point. Now, why weren't they included in a renovation program earlier? To be honest with you, there's a whole bunch of reasons. I think largely it has had to do with, as I mentioned, MCPS's capital program. Some of these sites are in the down county are a little bit more constrained, even if they're not too small for an athletic field. They have other things going on. Sometimes, for example, the elementary school where my kids went, Woodland, has portables all over the back lot. So you're not going to be able to, do much with that, even if you had enough room for an athletic field. So honestly, I'm not going to say it had nothing to do with race or class, but I think there's so many different layers of complexity about why a particular site did or didn't get included earlier, a lot of which has to do with the down county, smaller sites, more constrained sites, where their schools are crowded, where their schools are getting renovated for other reasons that was driving a whole lot of that.
And I can add a little history. As I said earlier, when this program started 20 years ago, there was a lot of involvement by the big sports leagues about getting game-size fields. So tangentially, how that played into equity, I can't say, but it was the bigger schools with the bigger fields in the areas where the leagues wanted them,
Yeah.
near population centers.
Yeah, so those are people who can pay, obviously, but it wasn't necessarily always the southwest part of the county versus everyone else. It was places where there was organized athletic leagues. I mean, Tacoma Soccer, for example, plays a lot of games at Tacoma Middle School. It's not a particularly affluent part of the county, and yet they are, Howard Cohn's very organized, has a big constituency. So I wouldn't deny that some of it has had to do with who's had money and who hasn't, but there's other things going on in addition to that.
And just you look at the map and you can tell that. I just think it's important to say it. And then could you talk about how the 500,000 starting in years 5 and 6, how we're going to prevent that going forward, and what that program will look like even outside of the 6-year CIP to make sure that we don't fall into this type of pattern again?
We're very excited to be a leader and using demographic data to develop an equity lens. We're just in our infancy, but we really want to partner with you and everyone else about how we advance this. So when we get to year 5 and 6, we can come here and clearly articulate each single factor that goes into our ratings, whether it's field condition, demographic data, capability of field to provide for community use, all these different criteria. We want to get to the point where we can come up here and just articulate why number 1 is number 1 and why number 20 is number 20 in a transparent way.
But just to give you an idea how complicated this gets really quickly, this fee discussion, we have documented with wildlife cameras use of athletic fields that we suspected were not being used even though they were permitted. And what we found was there are fields, people in certain parts of the county will reserve multiple fields that they don't intend to use. And to them, $5, $10 an hour is nothing. They can reserve 2 or 3 fields and use it if they decide to and not use it if they don't want to decide to. Obviously, if you are trying to keep the cost down countywide, you tend to aggravate that problem because the sort of people that think it's not a big deal to spend $10 or $20 an hour in the athletic field, those people are reserving multiple fields that aren't available for others to use. Meanwhile, in some other parts of the county, people saying, I can't afford $5 or $10 an hour. So we have a little bit of a, I wouldn't necessarily say it's an irreconcilable dilemma, but I think that in this study that Ms. Bell Pearson was talking about, and in our own review of our own fee structure, we need to figure out how do you target specific parts of the county and say we want to make it affordable, but we also don't want to create perverse incentives because, trust me, if you make the fees too low, people will find a way to sign up with, like, I'll sign up, the parent next door will sign up, the other, the treasurer of the soccer team, they all sign up, they all will sign up separately. They'll game that system. And we also, of course, have this, legacy historic use practice where leagues that had the fields for many years get signed up and they get to be first in line. That's something I think we have to address. That could be tremendously disruptive. There are legitimate reasons for people to say, wait a minute, I have an expectation. I've got this league that's got dozens of teams. I really need to know I'm going to have these fields. But that's another example of why this isn't just as simple as we should raise the fees or lower the fees.
Yeah,
in order to get racial and social equity.
There you go. Good. Thank you. Yeah, and it's a reminder. I often say these types of things require vigilance, and they're hard and complicated to do, but it's important work. So we look forward to working with you on it. And I'll yield to my colleagues because I know one is chomping at the bit, literally. So thank you very much.
So I did just want to tie in a couple things very quickly. I think that, again, our objective, I've got you, our objective in terms of making sure that we just say that this remains in our CIP is to allow for flexibility for the county executive. We don't want to hamstring the county executive, and so in respect to his budget, we want to be able to allow for him to have the flexibility in being able to figure it out, understanding that this is a priority for racial equity and social justice. So just putting that there, and that seems to be very clear from this joint committee plus one. You have a simple majority of the council that's here before you. Yeah, supermajority actually. So that actually says a lot in terms of how this is a priority. I will just say that, again, in case you mentioned this, when it comes to the evaluative criteria, because I know that's one of the things that Ms. Yao and Ms. Dunn had put in the packet, and we don't need to hash it here, but I do think that it's important in working with council staff. I know that you guys do demographics well. You guys have done it well, and we use a lot of your numbers for everything that we see in terms of trends that are happening in the county. I do just want to make sure that they're tied with where our priorities are that we're seeing on the council and in the school system as well. So I know that there have been some questions about some schools that have fallen off and others have gotten on, and trying to understand why. I don't even need to name them because it's not important to hear from that particular perspective in terms of those, but it is important that we're all on the same page when it comes to how we're prioritizing them, and so that will be really important. And I do just want to close with one of the things, and I'm thinking in the next 20 minutes, we'll be in meeting with our school system to talk about racial equity and social justice and then adopting the policy. So I do completely agree with Councilmember Jawando that the more that our departments are saying that this is what they're utilizing as a tool in which to move forward to create this new seed change that we're seeing in the county is going to be helpful to all of us. And so just as the message will be to MCPS in adopting this framework, it'll be important for a lot of our departments to say, because it's what you're doing. I mean, it is. It's exactly what you're doing. So, just saying that and tying it to that is incredibly important. So I'll stop there because I know we have a couple other folks who want to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much.
Immediate pass.
Well, first of all, I just want to say that this is like such music to my ears to really engage in these conversations now, truly looking at this issue of racial equity and social justice. It's changing the dynamic. It's changing the way that we now discuss our policy priorities, because at the end of the day, many of the parents, families that live in these areas, you know, they're not the ones that come to testify. They're not the ones who are necessarily leading the PTAs, but they are disproportionately affected. And what you were saying is very true. The issue that there had to be some decisions made, the answer to Councilmember Joanno, there had to be some decisions made when it came to issues of overcrowding in many of these schools, where to place these portables, but not necessarily those were the parents coming to testify and say, wait a minute, what about the green space? You know, some did, like the ones that came to testify to make sure that we didn't designate it as historic, the former Wheaton Youth Center, because they wanted green space, but that took a lot of work. My office was very involved in making sure parents understood what would happen. And I just want to submit to you that every time you walk into the Wheaton Library Rec Center and you see the faces of those young people, those children, those families, everybody there, always remember that they are not necessarily the ones that are in these chambers testifying, but look at how it's being utilized. So where were they before? And so that is part of this whole entire process of this racial equity and social justice, is because we have got to understand that if we don't look at it structurally, there are unintended consequences, right? So it is music to my ears, and I appreciate Councilmember Joanno saying, yeah, what the law that we pass is, it is racial equity and social justice, and we really need to be aligned. And I look forward to perhaps some kind of, you know, work group or something to really look at this issue of fees. I mean, my office, we have received, messages, and people have called regarding this issue of, you know, we have other folks who come in and reserve, people who have more money, and it impedes, you know, us from participating. We all know very well that, at least in the Latino community, there is such interest, obviously, in just saying, hey, let's go do a pickup soccer game Saturday morning. And a lot of people may not understand that you have to reserve, that there is a permitting process, right? Because back in Latin America, you kind of played in your neighborhood green space. And so there's so many things that we need to continue to understand. And I will submit to you also, and I'll close with this, we've had these conversations for a long time in terms of, you know, what is the purpose of our public facilities? What exactly is the purpose? It is to be there to be used by the public. So do we need to look at all the structures of how we're running, you know, CUP and ICB and everything? You know, do we need to do a wholesale sort of revision of Montgomery County 2019 versus when all of this was put in place? Because we've grown so much, and because now we have this legislation, it is time. You know, we tried. We got as far as establishing that fund for nonprofit organizations and, you know, folks that were providing services to low-income people, et cetera. But I just hope that we can revise and come back and revive this idea of really looking at these structures again, to make sure that our communities are able to use it. But I just want to say that it's just so exciting for us to be, you know, already talking about and seeing all of these decisions through that lens. It's a great thing. Thank you so much, and I appreciate so much everything that's been done thus far. Great job. And Councilmember Friedson, good job also in leading as a lead for parks,
Yeah.
right? Good work.
All right. Very much associate myself with everything everybody said so far. I just want to connect a couple of dots. One thing that hasn't been mentioned, which I'm particularly excited about, is Parks' research on identifying a seed of grass that will be better susceptible and better hold up to our unique climate here in our region. Because one of the reasons why some of the leagues book multiple fields is because the high number of cancellations, then in order to try and make up those games, to be able to keep the flow of play going, particularly the youth leagues, they need that flexibility on some level to be able to continue to credibly carry out the league play. But if you are in a better position to not have to have so many cancellations because you've got a better strain of grass, you have a field that's more ready to hold up to the elements, then that will create sort of a cascading effect that's very positive. And so I know you guys have been working really hard on identifying strains of grass that are really good. The other thing that I think is important for everybody to understand is when fields were designed originally, particularly for the older schools, clearly they weren't the priority in the development of those spaces. And so quite frankly, they weren't very well designed. There's not enough drainage. They're not located in optimal locations. They often have a lot of shade. And that also leads to challenges on how to, once the renovation is complete, to maintain those fields, which we haven't quite articulated yet, but obviously is going to be a very important part of this conversation as well, because we can spend tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to renovate a field. All it takes is one high drenched grass, water day, rain day, for people who are not permitted to use the field and then ruin it for everybody else. So that's something that I think is going to be important. And with regards to CUPF, I know at least a while ago, the source of the fund balance was primarily coming from the Civic Building because it's been such a success. I counted this up last year. My colleagues will appreciate this. We did our year-end review. I visited, and I'm sure you guys did too, the Civic Building more than 67 times last year. Yeah. And some of those were like 3 or 4 times in the same day. And so obviously that facility is getting a lot of use, and understandably the ICB at least 2 years ago wanted to prioritize making sure that the maintenance schedule kept pace with the high use and demand of that facility, which I certainly understand and respect. The fee structure conversation is obviously very important. We have not had, at least in my lifetime, a significant discussion, at least in the last 10 years. In terms of any sort of, and I was there for the pushback. And I was part of the pushback, to be quite candid. Because in recreation, the fee structure, it's sort of like moving money from your left pocket to the right pocket. And that's why OMB is going to be really important in this discussion to hold recreation and our sister county agencies harmless as we, because if we have recreation is one of the last vestiges of recreational use of play. And if we screw that up, then we're in trouble. I want to call to my colleagues' attention that our colleagues in the Office of Legislative Oversight are right now conducting an analysis of youth sports participation in the county. And I specifically requested that they analyze this issue of equity across the entire county. And so we will be getting a report back when we come back from winter recess on what's going on out there and get a better snapshot of what's happening. And where there are holes, and there are holes, that is an area where I think programmatically, I know my colleagues have expressed interest in filling those holes on that equity route. So last thing on fees, I think particularly the leagues, if they knew that the enhancement of the fees, at least some percentage of it, was in fact being designated to ensure the higher quality and the maintenance of those fields, I don't think you'll get the same level of pushback as you did 5 or 6 years ago. I think the pushback that I experienced then primarily was, you're going to increase my fees, but I'm not getting anything in return. It's going to be the same quality. And I think if we can designate some of those funds, it will make it a lot easier for us for organizations to be able to digest that use. And then with those additional funds would put CUPF in a better position to more proactively address the equity issues, because you'd have a higher fund balance to work with. So I think it could be sort of a win-win if it's done well and transparently and aggressively. So those are just some of my initial thoughts, but this is obviously a really important ongoing discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Albornoz. A quick question. How many more fields are there in the permit program today than there were 4 years ago?
Well, I don't want to guess. We're going to have to get back.
Is it a lot, though? Is it dozens, or? Because you've been taking over fields progressively as you renovate them.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we've increased the permit database or the inventory. They
So
were
the
always
inventory is
available.
the same.
We're just increasing the quality of the surface
Gotcha.
for the permittee, but they've always been in the cuff inventory.
Okay. Second to last comment, Mr. Frieden.
Thank you. A couple things. One, thank you to my colleague and the former rec director who certainly knows this issue really well. I did want to raise, I hope that recreational facilities, is the follow-up to this conversation as well. I think, we talked about the small play spaces, which I think is critical. We talked about going back and renovating the legacy fields that need some TLC, so to speak, after their natural life cycles of 20-plus years in circulation. And I think the recreational facilities also should be part of that. So I just wanted to put a pin in that and a marker on that. I think it's a critical piece of it. I did appreciate Councilmember Albernaz's point. William Donald Schaefer used to say, referring usually to state money and federal money, but if it's out of my left pocket or out of my right pocket, it's still my damn money. So I think, in that sense, we have to work through those challenges and make sure that we do still realize there's still public dollars, if we're having our departments who are using these facilities, and they have a critical purpose, much to the point that Councilmember Navarro, Councilmember Joando, Councilmember Rice, and all of us have been saying of making sure that we're doing this in a way that holds those folks harmless. And so I think that's really important. I just wanted to raise one, the small play spaces. I think it is critical as part of these conversations, to the point that Councilmember Navarro mentioned of being able to play in your in the green space in your community. We don't have as much of that as used to exist, and so these public spaces become even more critical. Parks takes on an even heightened role. Those small fields that don't require permits, that can just be used for casual play and casual recreation. And to Councilmember Rice's point, I used to play in my street too. We played street hockey every day. I don't think it was the safest place to play. It was probably more contact than was appropriate for people of those ages. But we do need places that young people can walk to and be able to run around outside and to be able to recreate and blow off energy and blow off stress and do all of the things that we expect them to do. And so I hope, as we're figuring out these small play spaces, and I look forward to hearing back with those conversations, with the superintendent and MCPS staff, that we really think of these as opportunities to have unpermitted recreational opportunities, because I think that is a really critical piece of this. And I did just also want to raise, I know in way back before Y2K in 1999, there was a working group looking at the lack of ball fields available. And I just wanted to find out, is that group still active? Is there a use of that group today? Is there a way to discuss it? Because now we're talking about activating our ball fields, but there's also a question of what ball fields are available, what the use is. And I know the OLO report will look at some aspects of this, but I was just wondering, I know Parks had, there was a group that was looking at this, which was part of the impetus for this whole conversation where, as was mentioned earlier, of what was decided and what wasn't. Part of it was that there was just a lack of formal, league quality, permittable ball field space.
Well, we had a consultant do some work on analyzing ball field capacity and conditions. And, one of the takeaways from that is we do need more ball fields, but one of the major desires on the part of the users, at least of the permitted fields, because those are the people we can contact because we have their information, is to maintain the fields better, to get the grass in better condition, which is what's driven a lot of this. We certainly also have a documented need for more fields, but I think that we've tried to put renovations first because we don't want to come to you and ask you for tens of millions of dollars in supplemental appropriations as we find additional patches of ground to try to get a new field. Our first choice is to try to make the ones we've got more playable, more usable. Then and only then are we going to look at how can we add additional spaces. But we have to add more spaces, not just for cricket and things that are sort of emerging or futsal, but also even for soccer, which is a longstanding need, but especially, in the down county, it's very difficult to locate additional space to put those fields.
Great. Well, I look forward to operationalizing and seeing this plan come to fruition with the commitment from the county executive and the county council. And I look forward to then the next steps to this, because I think this is part of a broader ongoing conversation as we've discussed today. And I think that there's a lot here and a lot of need and a lot of desire from the community to make sure that it happens. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been a terrific update. I think we've made a lot of progress. Really pleased. This has been one of my highest priorities in my work at the council, and pleased to be joined by so many of my colleagues and feeling a sense of urgency. And we'll keep in touch about the play spaces. It sounds like you're embarking on a new initiative. I think we're really eager to see how that proceeds. We didn't really talk about the issue of common areas within the fields, but I know we do. Those are your dugouts and your other little features that are pretty important. And so we'll keep that in mind. And as you are proceeding with your budget, make sure that that's part of your plan. That's got to be part of the maintenance plan. We didn't really talk about the rec fields today, but we do want that to be in, one strategy here. We'll be getting an update soon about the futsal. Gabe's gone. We didn't talk much about high school strategies, but we were talking mostly about the fields that are coming in the elementary and middle school. But I know that there's some work that's going on there. Last point, 700 fields, I think you said, Mike, 700 fields. Important thing to keep all in perspective around the use of synthetic fields. 689 of them or something are natural grass. We are, the use of synthetic is very much the exception to a rule based on very unique criteria. But generally speaking, we are all in on grass, natural grass. We want people to play on grass. 700 fields, very few synthetic fields. So please, to those watching, to keep that in perspective as well. And we will continue this conversation in the new budget. Thank you to my colleague, the chair. Thanks.
All right, so that joint meeting is adjourned. We will start with our education and culture meeting in a few minutes, hopefully around 11:03. Allow for them to change over in the TV booth.